Hi, this video is split into three parts dealing with using Adobe Illustrator in the web design workflow. Part 1 will be dealing with creating wireframes, Part 2 will be dealing with creating style tiles, and Part 3 will be dealing with creating prototypes. Firstly, let's look at wireframes. So what is a wireframe in the context of web design? It is a graphic containing a series of boxes arranged into columns and grids representing the layout of images, text, and other elements on a web page. The purpose of creating wireframes for pages before actually creating the web pages is to get a sense of how web page elements will flow on a page and get agreement on the structure of the page before actually moving on to looking at things like typography, color, photos, and styling. Of particular importance is working out through wireframing the changes to columns and box elements for different screen widths in advance so that web pages can be responsive to different devices with different screen widths. It is a good strategy to present the wireframe layout of pages to clients before any dialogue about typography, color, and decoration, which often distracts the client and leads to a slower process to reach consensus. You want the client to see the structure and layout and focus on this without being distracted by colors, photos, font styles, and decorations. So what are the minimum things that should be included in an effective wireframe? Well, firstly, a column system. You need to decide on the default width. 960 pixels is a good choice because many different numbers are divisible into this number. For example, 3 times 320, 4 times 240, 5 times 192, 6 times 160, and so on. All whole numbers. It is common to work on a 4, 8, or 12 column system. Your columns should have a gap between them called a gutter. This should be wide enough to create a visual gap between columns of boxes. 20 to 30 pixels is usually fine. So to work out the columns for, say, a 4-column layout, you could have 220 pixel width columns with 3 20-pixel gutters, making a total of 940 pixels, and then a left and right margin of 10 pixels, totaling your 960 pixels. The next thing a wireframe should have after the column system are boxes with crosses through them representing the images on the page. Try and keep the sizes within the column width sizes. Although this is not a rule, sometimes you might want an image that doesn't conform to this. It is a good guideline. Next, boxes in lines representing text, taller boxes representing headings. Then, any other graphic elements like borders. Next, an overlay of text indicating basic measurements and the HTML structural elements. And finally, at least one version of the wireframe for smaller screens, such as for smartphones. So switching across to Adobe Illustrator, let's have a look at creating a simple wireframe to give you some idea of the simple set of tools you'll need to master. You could use any method to create your wireframe, even PowerPoint or Microsoft Word, or even just a pencil and paper. But I believe that Illustrator is by far the most powerful and flexible digital tool for creating wireframes if you are going to be doing this on a regular basis. So the first thing is to create a new document. So in the welcome screen here, I can click on Create New, or I can go to File, New. And in this dialog box, I'm going to choose the intent across the top, Web, and then I'm going to choose the document preset common, which is 1366 by 768 pixels. Now all that choosing web does is it ensures that this document is set to the RGB workspace. So if I go to more settings here, you'll see that the color mode is RGB, and what it also does is it turns on something called Align to Pixel Grid. Now, without having to go into in-depth explanations here, all this means is that your document will be set up optimally for web output. And I'll press Create. It doesn't really matter what size you choose for your document because 960 is going to be my width. So whatever is on either side of 960 will be basically browser expandable area. Talking about size, typically you would be increasing the height of your artboard as you go, because web pages normally expand vertically with content, so it's perfectly okay to scroll up and down on a web page. It's not acceptable to make your user scroll left and right or horizontally. So horizontal scrolling is taken care of with responsive design. Vertical scrolling is acceptable. Okay, so once we've got our document created, the next step is to look at layers. So you'll see that this is a new workspace in the 2018 version of Illustrator CC, and the workspace is called Essentials. But if you've worked with Illustrator before, you'll notice that the previous Essentials workspace had the control panel across the top, and that is now missing, and it's been replaced by the properties panel down the side. Now the properties panel is great, but it does not contain everything that we need. So I'm going to switch back from this workspace switcher to the Essentials Classic, which brings back my properties, my control panel across the top, and it also brings back a whole lot of essential panels. So I don't know where Adobe is coming from by saying that this Essentials workspace has all the essentials you need. It certainly doesn't. It doesn't have all of your stroke options and things like that. It doesn't even have swatches. So Essentials Classic is fine, and you also can then go to Window and to Properties. In fact, Properties is here already, and you've got access to your Properties panel anyway. So I would recommend you stay with Essentials Classic. So we're going to look at layers, because when you're managing your wireframe, it's a good idea to work in layers. So your Layers panel is across the side here, and you'll see that by default every Illustrator file comes with at least one layer called Layer 1. So I'm going to create what I consider to be the most essential and bare minimum layers for wireframing, and the first one will be called Background. So I'll just double click on the name here and type Background, and then in the bottom right hand corner I'll click on the button that says Create New Layer, and I'll make another layer, and this one I will call Images, and I'll continue with Graphics, and then Text, and then finally Notes. And I think that's sort of the bare minimum. So if you are new to Illustrator and you haven't encountered layers before and do not know what they are, think of them as a filing system for organizing stuff into categories that make sense for your intent. But in addition to being a filing system, objects in layers that are above other objects will cover those objects when overlapping, and layers above other layers will also cover those layers below. So your design is built up by stacking objects on from top to bottom and arranging them into meaningful layers. But if you think of it as a filing system, I think that's probably the most accurate. It doesn't matter whether you use layers or not in terms of the final design. If someone looks at your Illustrator design, they're not going to be able to tell whether you did or didn't use layers. Layers are for you to be organized. Next, after layers, I'm going to create one additional artboard so that I can look at responsive design as I go. So I'm going to just close the layers panel down. So when you work in Illustrator, your design area is called an artboard, and an artboard is really just a designated area of your total design space for a particular design purpose. So if I start zooming out here using the shortcut key Command-, you'll see that eventually, if I keep going, I'll get to see the perimeter of my entire document. That's the dark gray area. The white area is simply one artboard. So I can fill up this entire artboard, entire design area with artboards. So I'm just going to add one additional artboard for a smartphone design. So I'm going to press Command-0 to fit back in, and then just Command- a few times just so that I'm zoomed out a little bit, and then I'm going to hold down the space bar and pan across a little bit. Okay, so there is my first artboard, which is going to be for my computer screen version of my web page. So I'm going to go to the artboard tool, which is over here, and you'll see that now my artboard presents itself with these handles around it, almost like it was just a rectangle object. So what I'm going to do is add a new artboard by clicking on this button up on the control panel which says new artboard. Okay, and then I'm going to go to the presets over here, and I'm going to choose, just because it's the topmost smartphone option, I'm going to choose iPhone 6, 6S. And I'm also going to set it to portrait, because most people on smartphones consume web content in portrait mode. And then I'll just move it into position, and then I will click back on my original artboard, and I'll just rename this screen, and my second artboard I'll rename smartphone. Then I'll switch back to my selection tool and press Alt Command 0 to fit all artboards, and you'll see there now I have a screen artboard and a smartphone artboard. Now I am going to change the height of the artboard as I go to accommodate the content. So one layer that I forgot to add was a layer for the column system. So right at the top above everything else, I'm going to put in columns. Okay, so the first thing is to make my background. So I'm going to be working on the screen artboard, so I'll just zoom into that, and I'm going to take my rectangle tool, set the fill to a sort of medium gray color, and set the stroke to none. And then I'm just going to draw a rectangle, and then in my properties inspector I'm going to set the reference point to top left, and then set the X value to 0, the Y value to 0, the width to 960, remember we decided 960 was a good number to use, and the height to 768, which is what this artboard is. Then what I want to do is I want to align this to the center of the artboard. So I'm going to go to my window, align, to bring up the align panel, and I'm going to expand the align panel from this little arrow until I've got these options here, and I'm going to choose align to artboard, and then this option which is horizontal align center. Okay, so now my artboard is now my rectangle is perfectly aligned to the center of the artboard. So I can go back now and make sure that this object is in the background layer. So if I select it, you can see that I didn't select the correct layer to begin with, so it's actually gone into the columns layer. So to move something from one layer to another, select it, you'll find a little colored box to the right of that layer name, and that's indicating that the object you have selected is in this layer. Drag that little colored box down to the layer that you want to move that object to. So I've moved that now down to the background layer, and I'm going to lock that layer by clicking next to the little eyeball, which will lock the layer. The eyeball shows and hides the layer. Okay, then I'm going to go back up to the columns layer, and I'm going to in fact, what I'm going to do is unlock the background layer, and I'm going to select this rectangle and copy it, and then lock that layer, go up to my columns layer, and edit paste in place. And I'm going to change the color to a turquoise with an opacity of 35%. And then all I'm going to do in my properties inspector is make sure the reference point is top left and set the width to 220. Okay, so there's my first column of 220. I now need to move this object by 10 pixels in to create a 10 pixel margin. So I'm going to, where I've got my X value, remember X is left to right, I'm going to add 10 to that. So I'm going to click inside that field, X field, and after the initial value I'm going to type plus 10 and press enter, and you can see it now moves over by 10. Okay, so now I need to make a copy of this, and I need to copy it across and put in a 20 pixel gutter. So that means 220 plus 20 is 240. So I'm going to go to Object, Transform, Move, and on the horizontal it's going to be 220 plus 20, which will be 240, and I'm going to say copy. and then I'm going to repeat that action using the keyboard shortcut Command D. So Command D just means repeat the last transformation. Okay, so now I have my 4 columns of 220 pixels wide with a 20 pixel gutter between them and then a 10 pixel margin on the left and the right. So as we go along, each component in the page I'm going to also do on the smartphone version, just so that it reduces the amount of work at the end. So if I take this background layer and I select that rectangle object in there, I'm going to make a copy of it across to the smartphone artboard. So to copy something, Alt, drag, and I'm just going to snap that exactly into the size of that artboard. So that's what our background will do when we are in the smartphone screen width. Okay, then I'm going to go up to the columns layer. I'll select all those objects and I'll do the same, Alt, drag. And with these columns, it's really unrealistic to have 4 columns for a smartphone. So what I'm going to do is select 2 and delete them, select the remaining 2 and just spread them out. Okay, and just to make sure that we've got whole numbers here, it's really quite important. You shouldn't have half pixels. I'm going to select and check my width. It's 339 point something, so I'm going to change that to 340. And the same for this one, 340. And then the distance is 20 pixels from the edge of that artboard, which is fine. And the distance for this one is, let's make that 390. Okay, so we've got whole numbers. So that's our screen version with columns and our smartphone version with columns. Okay, so the next step is to now put in some indications of where images are going to go. So in my layers, I'm going to make sure the columns layer is locked and the background layer is locked and the images layer is selected. And then images are usually indicated by boxes with crosses through them. So I'm going to take my rectangle tool and I'm just going to draw a box and I'll zoom into it, Command plus, and I'll give it a dark gray fill and no stroke. Okay, and then I'll deselect it and then I'll take my line tool and set my line tool to have no fill and a black stroke, and let's set the stroke to 2 points, and then I'm going to just draw across like that and that. Okay, I'll select those 3 objects, the rectangle and the 2 lines, and group them, so object group or Command G, and then I'm going to go to my Creative Cloud Libraries panel and I'm going to make a new library. So I'm going to go to the options and choose create new library, and I'll call this Mike's wireframe stuff. Okay, and then I'm going to take this object and just drag it in there and rename it to image symbol. Okay, now this symbol can be used for images and graphics. So for this particular one, we're going to put in the image for the hero shot. So the hero shot is going to be 4 columns wide and quite high, and it'll be lower down. So I'm just moving by holding shift to keep it in a straight line. Okay, so that's where the main picture will go. Okay, then above here will be a graphic for the logo, which is going to take up 2 columns. So I'm going to switch to the graphics layer and drag another image symbol in, drop it, and this will be 2 columns. Okay, and so I'm going to continue doing this until I have all the images set up for this artboard, and then I'm going to take these images and copy them across to the smartphone side and resize them to what I think should happen on the smartphone version. So I'm just going to jump ahead until I've done that. Okay, so what I've done is I have created in the images layer. If I just hide and show that layer, you'll see I've created all the boxes for images, and in the graphics layer all the boxes for graphics for both artboards. Now you can see I've had to go beyond the bottom of each artboard, so I need to extend these artboards down. So I'm going to switch to the artboard tool, and then I'm going to estimate the height that I need just by dragging down on the screen version, and then switch to the smartphone version and drag down as well. Now I'm guessing at the moment I might need to take them back up again. You might be wondering why the smartphone version looks quite big comparatively speaking to the screen version, and the only reason for that is because smartphones have a much higher pixel density than computer screens, and therefore when those pixels are represented here, it makes the actual smartphone size look bigger, but it won't actually physically be bigger because those pixels will be squeezed into a smaller space. Okay, so I need to also extend the background objects, so let's take this one and switch to my selection tool and make that one taller, and then the smartphone one. Okay, I can lock that layer again, and then for columns 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm holding shift to select multiple objects when I click on them. Okay, and then I can lock that layer as well. Okay, so from here it's simply a case of repeating this process. So I'm going to speed it up a little bit just to explain to you what I'm going to do first, and then I'll do it and I'll just speed it up so that you don't have to watch a slow process. So the next thing I'm going to do is make a graphic representing headings and add that to my library, and then also a graphic representing text, and I'm also going to add that to my library, and then I'm just going to use those in both of these artboards to represent where text is going to go. So the next thing is to add any graphic elements in addition to images and text. So these pages don't really have much. There's a horizontal line that will appear. So I'm going to go to the graphics layer and take my rectangle tool. In fact, I'll use the line tool instead. And there will be a horizontal line running across there. And I'll just represent that as a dark gray, a couple of pixels in width, and just move it into position make sure that it's 960. Okay, so that's that, and then I'm going to make a copy of that down there as a separator, and another one there. And then for the smartphone version, I will put in another one here. Okay, let me just bring that down in width. And yeah, I think just move that across and down a bit, and then these elements I'll move down and make a duplicate of this line over here, and another one at the bottom. Okay, so the final step in the wireframe is to put in some notes and labels and so on. So I'm just going to show you one or two, and then I'll just show you the finished product. So normally you wouldn't do this for both wireframes. You would do it for the main wireframe, and then maybe there might be one or two notes or additional labels for the smartphone version. So I'm just going to go to the screen version, and in my layers I'll lock all layers except the notes layer and make sure that layer is selected. So I'm just going to take my type tool, and I'll just click in a blank area here, and I'll type in there logo graphic. Okay, I'm going to make my text, you can decide what you want. I'm going to go with red and size it up a bit, and that will go there. And I'm actually going to change the arrangement of layers, so the notes layer is above the columns layer so that it's more readable, and I really don't think that red is that readable against the turquoise, so I'm going to change that to yellow. Okay, that's much better. So then I'm going to duplicate that across here, and I'll make a note here, strap line, mission statement, search box. Okay, and I'll move that into position. Then here I'll put in a label, navigation bar, and so I'm just going to continue alt dragging a copy and then double clicking to switch to my type tool, and then changing the text. So this will be hero image or hero shot image. Okay, and so I'm going to continue doing. Okay, so those are the basic labels. Notice the way I've used yellow rectangles, or at least rectangles with a yellow stroke, to indicate the actual extent of areas. So we have hero shot, bucket 1 info, bucket 2 info, and so far, and so on. In web design, we often call a bucket a section that's kind of a self-contained image, heading, and a little bit of information. So these are 4 buckets. Then here we have 2 stories, and then navigation bar and footer info. So the other bit of information that we need to include here is our HTML structure. So I'm going to do that on the sides here. So I'm just going to take my pen tool, and I'm going to set the fill to none and the stroke to red. And then I'm going to click, hold down shift, click, and holding shift ensures that it stays in a perfectly vertical or horizontal line. and then back to my selection tool, and I'm just going to increase the weight of that to 2. So I have this indication here of an area, and then I'm going to go to my stroke panel, and I'm just going to put an arrowhead on the beginning and end of that. Okay, so we have this arrowhead across there. Then I'm going to take my text, make a copy, change the color to red, and I'm just going to say container. Okay, so if you know anything about HTML, you'll know that most web pages are within a div tag with some kind of name called wrapper or container or something like that. And I'm going to then take my pen tool and I'm going to indicate where the header area is going to be. So holding shift, this will be the header. Okay, and I'm going to go back to my eyedropper and just pick up from the other side, so it's the same, and then Alt drag a copy of this text and I'll type in here header. Okay, and I'm just going to continue doing that. So this area here, the hero shot, I'm just going to double click on that to isolate it, switch to my direct selection tool and just take these 2 points on this path and move them down into position. Then double click away, make a copy of the text, and this will be a section. And this will also be a section, and I'll make a copy down. Again, double click, switch to my direct selection tool and just change the height of that. Okay, and then also each one of these buckets will be an article. Okay, so I'm just going to take my pen tool and just indicate that. So eyedropper, so those are articles. And then, in fact, we can actually take this whole thing and duplicate that down. And direct selection tool. Okay, and then finally we'll make the footer. So that's this last section here. So the shortcut for direct selection tool is A, and move that down, and that will be footer. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to wireframing. You can go into a lot more detail than this, and with your HTML structure you can even go in and indicate what's going to be H1s and H2s and paragraphs and so on. But you should get the idea from this that a wireframe is really a way of showing the structural boxes in a layout and how they will flow through the height of the page and also for narrower screen widths. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please continue on to watch part 2 dealing with Illustrator and style tiles.